Hi, I'm John Ralston Saul. Reconciliation isn't just about being nice. It has to include restitution. In cities, we live pressed up against each other, so this is the easiest place to do reconciliation and restitution. And one of the easiest ways of doing restitution is to ensure that the place occupied by Indigenous people is the appropriate place, which is to say big enough, visible enough in terms of authority, in terms of images, in terms of voices, in every single way, that when we think about the city, that the city is clearly an Indigenous place. So most of you know that Indigenous people are the fastest growing part of the Canadian population. What you probably don't know is that the result of that is that Indigenous people are almost back to the population levels of about 400 years ago when people like me arrived. So they've almost recovered from the damage that we did, at least in that sense. And then this other astonishing thing, which is over the last couple of decades, approximately half of that Indigenous population, as if they weren't already in the city, have moved to the city. So most of the non-Indigenous people imagine our cities as places of immigration, Winnipeg, immigration city, and somehow culturally and economically as centers linked to Western civilization, the Western model of the city. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I suppose if you're middle class, that means you're sedentary and you're busy most of the time typing on a computer when you're not drinking a latte and going to the gym to recover from the fact that you never get up from your computer. And somehow, whatever you say, your primary loyalty is to other cities like this one. The only thing is that, unlike other cities in other places now, in Winnipeg, more than 75,000 of the citizens of the city are Indigenous, and throughout Western Canada, that's true for pretty well every city, I think every city, in fact. Toronto, apparently it's about 100,000 Indigenous peoples. And I hear, the people who think these are European cities of immigration sort of saying quietly, well, maybe now that they've come to the cities and left the reserves, they'll give up asking for all sorts of things and integrate and assimilate. I mean, you must have all heard this, or maybe you've said it yourself. The only difficulty with this argument is they're not immigrants. They're from here. And the truth is that virtually every major Canadian city, as the elder pointed out about Winnipeg, except Regina, is built exactly where there was and is a multi-thousand-year-old Indigenous tradition, life, settlement, and so on. Literally, there isn't a major city in Canada where we, the immigrants, thought up a better place to install ourselves. The centers of these cities are the centers of Indigenous settlements, and they were very often, in many ways, permanent settlements. There were summer gatherings, even larger. It's in places like the Forks that trading alliances that went over thousands of kilometers were put together, that military alliances were put together, that marriages were negotiated. When my family came to Winnipeg, not long after the treaties in the 1880s, treaty in the 1880s, this province was governed by a Métis premier, John Norquay, who governed for 10 years. I think it was 78 to 88. Winnipeg was the capital of the Métis Nation. It still is. The point is that Indigenous people have been in Winnipeg for thousands of years. They either never left or they're coming back to their city. So I may be misusing the word city as a European understands it. I could use the word settlement, but let's just call it the Indigenous city, which they're coming back to and expressing themselves and breathing and expanding in. Some of them, of course, are leaving disastrous reserves where they were forced to go, where the land is terrible, so that people like me could have the good land. And some of them are going back and forth between reserves and the city, so they're leading a double life I hear people saying, well, shouldn't they choose? I don't have to choose. I go back and forth. I have a double life. In fact, I have a triple life. But in both cases, Indigenous people are returning to their city, to their good land, and, very important, to their spiritual centers. They're reestablishing themselves in their historic capitals. I'm mixing the kind of Western language and the Indigenous language on purpose. For some of the people who come, we know this in Winnipeg, it's very tough. Just imagine the kid who comes off a small reserve, a tough reserve, and the school they're going to has more kids in it than there is in the total population of the reserve. Imagine how tough all of that is. And there are other reasons. But there are many, many others who are here in Winnipeg and in other capitals creating leadership structures and reimagining how to live, how to be in the Indigenous city in the 21st century. And you think about Winnipeg, you know, headquarters of the First Nations politically, capital of the Métis Nation, headquarters of virtually every Manitoba and many Western and national Indigenous organizations. Urban reserves are springing up all over the place in the West. Used to be, what, in the 50s, forbidden for an Indigenous person to become a lawyer by law. And now there are over 2,000 Indigenous lawyers in Canada, and lawyers tend to operate out of cities. You know, you can think what you want about that. University professors, look at the University of Winnipeg, University of Manitoba. The president of the University of Winnipeg is Métis. Students from all over the province and other provinces coming to the city, to their city, in order to study and to graduate. Writers, artists, musicians, often grouped together in urban centers. So in many ways, it's already happening. Parts of the city don't realize the extent to which it's happening. And I believe, for those of us who are not Indigenous, that this is an enormous opportunity to reimagine the urban idea, to rediscover the Indigenous idea of community, culture, belonging, politics. Winnipeg, I come here about once, twice, 3 times a year. Winnipeg's already changing for the better because of this. It's already discovering old truths about this place, how to inhabit it differently. We have to open ourselves to all of this. We have to rethink who we are in our cities. So yes, there is a Euro-US virtual culture of cities led by a couple of super cities. There's a class order in this international city structure, but beware. But if you fall into that, you could well end up as a new kind of colonial outpost of that model, the colonial imitative city. After all, Canada is the world's 2nd largest city. Our cities are the core of that. We have to beware any model that isolates us from our reality, the enormous reality all around us, the Indigenous enormous reality all around us. And remember that Indigenous peoples are returning to their cities, their centers, having resisted for over 150 years almost every onslaught against them, fought for their way back from near extinction, demonstrated staying power, courage, stubborn patience, drive, an amazing sense of strategy to outsmart people like us. And they will have the capacity, whether we agree or not, to reimagine the cities. Something very authentic is happening in Winnipeg and elsewhere. I've always said that the essential nature of Canada is its ability to live comfortably with complexity and contradictions. Open yourselves up to this reconceiving of the Indigenous philosophy of place and belonging, and with that, of the idea of the West and the idea of immigration, which will work together with the Indigenous ideas. Listen. Watch what is already happening. Open yourself up to this possibility of a reality which could turn cities like Winnipeg into new models of creative tension, positive tension, based on a new kind of humanist comfort, born here, a form of inclusivity and originality. Miigwech.